At 0248 inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Chung-Hoon, a sonar technician second class was running a routine passive acoustic analysis on the Gulf of Oman water column when she found something that made her stop and look again. Not a contact in the conventional sense, not a bearing or a range or a track symbol on her display, an absence. A zone of acoustic silence 11 nautical miles northeast of the USS George H.W. Bush Strike Group, where the ambient noise floor had dropped below what the thermal layering, the biological scatter, and the commercial shipping density of this part of the Arabian Sea should have been producing. Empty ocean doesn't go quiet. Something was in that pocket of silence, absorbing sound, moving through the water at a speed low enough to suppress cavitation, running on batteries to eliminate the diesel signature it would have produced if it had snorkeled in the last 8 hours. Something that had been closing on the carrier for most of the night watch. She flagged the contact at 0249 and called the watch officer. The USS George H.W. Bush is a Nimitz-class nuclear carrier, CVN-77, displacing 104,000 tons at full load with a crew of approximately 5,000 and an air wing that makes it the most capable collection of airborne combat power currently operating anywhere in the North Arabian Sea. She had entered Fifth Fleet waters 3 weeks earlier as American diplomatic engagement with Tehran had reached the point where both sides had stopped pretending the conversations were producing results. Her movement was not secret. A carrier group of this size is visible to commercial satellite services, trackable by passive acoustic arrays across ocean basins, and permanently present in the intelligence picture of every regional military capable of maintaining one. What was below her was meant to change that equation. Iran's Kilo-class submarines are Russian-built, delivered to Tehran in the 1990s under contracts negotiated when Russia needed hard currency and was less concerned than it later became about what its customers did with strategic equipment. 3 were acquired. Iran refers to them internally as the Tarek class. Each one runs 74 meters in length, displaces roughly 3,000 tons submerged, and carries 6 533mm torpedo tubes in the bow. The Russian export designation for these boats was Project 877EKM. The nickname the Russian Navy gave the class was Black Hole, after the anechoic rubber tiles bonded to the exterior hull that compressed the boat's acoustic signature to the point where distinguishing it from ambient seawater noise in a complex acoustic environment requires specific, sustained attention. The tiles are the Kilo's strategic asset. They absorb active sonar pings rather than reflecting them, and they suppress the outgoing mechanical noise that passive sonar arrays listen for. Against a Navy not equipped to detect them, in water conditions favorable to acoustic masking, a Kilo running on electric motors can be genuinely difficult to find. The Gulf of Oman is warm, which creates thermal layers that scatter acoustic energy. Commercial shipping traffic through the area is substantial, providing mechanical noise cover. These conditions are exactly the ones Iranian doctrine had been built around for 30 years. Use the geometry and acoustics of the region to position a quiet submarine close enough to a carrier to fire before the ASW screen can react. The doctrine is coherent. It is also 30 years old, and the ASW screen it was designed to defeat no longer exists. 4 days before the Chung-Hoon sonar technician noticed the acoustic gap, a P-8A Poseidon operating from Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE had been running a systematic sonobuoy pattern across the Kilo's most probable transit routes into the Gulf of Oman. The P-8's AN/APS-154 advanced airborne sensor flagged a brief partial snorkel mast detection at the outer edge of its coverage envelope, a 14-second contact before it submerged again. 14 seconds, enough to establish a position datum, enough to feed into a probabilistic tracking model that, combined with signals intelligence from Iranian naval communication intercepts and shipping lane analysis, produced a track with sufficient confidence to pre-position ASW assets. The Iranian submarine was not a surprise. It was an anticipated problem with a prepared response. By the time the contact was detected at 0249, the Bush Strike Group had been building its ASW picture around the Kilo's approach for 96 hours. The acoustic gap the sonar technician identified wasn't an accidental discovery. It was the confirmation of a track that had been developing since the P-8's initial datum, now close enough to produce a detectable acoustic shadow in the passive sensor picture. At 0253, the tactical action officer aboard the Bush received the contact evaluation. Classification: probable submarine. Bearing 068, range 11 nautical miles. profile consistent with Project 877 Kilo class on electric drive. The recommendation appended to the report was one sentence: recommend immediate helicopter ASW prosecution. She authorized it without hesitation. The MH-60R Seahawk is the Navy's answer to the specific problem of finding a submarine that's trying not to be found. It's worth understanding what makes it different from earlier generations of ASW helicopters, because the difference is what made this engagement possible and what makes Iranian Kilo doctrine increasingly untenable against prepared American ASW screens. The AN/AQS-22 Advanced Airborne Low Frequency Sonar, the system the crews call ALFS, is a dipping sonar. The helicopter holds a hover, lowers a transducer array on a cable to a programmed depth, and listens. Not with a single hydrophone, but with an array that produces a beam-formed acoustic picture of the water column below and around the dip point. The low-frequency operating range penetrates thermal layers that defeat higher frequency systems, which is specifically significant in the Gulf of Oman, where warm surface water creates acoustic barriers that older systems couldn't reliably see through. But the AQS-22's real capability is processing. The returns it produces are fed into a classification system that has been trained against acoustic libraries containing the signatures of every submarine class in the world's inventories, built from decades of surveillance recordings, engineered to separate a Kilo's propulsion signature from the biological and thermal noise that surrounds it. The system doesn't tell the crew it heard something, it tells them what it heard with a confidence percentage, and it updates that classification in real time as the contact develops. Two MH-60Rs from Helicopter Maritime Strike Squadron 37 lifted from the Bush's flight deck at 03:01, 8 minutes after the contact evaluation. A third was airborne 90 seconds later. They spread into a triangulated prosecution pattern, flying at low altitude to minimize their own radar exposure, maintaining emissions discipline. The Iranian submarine crew heard nothing unusual. They rarely do. At 0314, Romeo Flight Lead established its first dip position 8 nautical miles from the contact datum. The transducer went into the water at 180 feet. The acoustic picture resolved in under 2 minutes. Single-screw propulsion. Machinery noise consistent with Project 877 hull. Depth estimate between 85 and 100 meters. Speed approximately 4 knots. Bearing had shifted slightly northeast since the Chung Hoon's initial detection. The submarine was still adjusting its approach geometry, still working toward a firing solution on the carrier's projected track. The second helicopter confirmed the contact from an offset dip point 6 nautical miles away. Triangulation produced a position circle of uncertainty less than 700 meters across. Inside the Iranian control room, the crew was running a fire control solution. They had been tracking the Bush's acoustic signature for hours. A 104,000-ton nuclear carrier at 18 knots produces a distinctive low-frequency sound pattern that is not difficult for a modern sonar suite to classify at extended ranges. The range had been closing since 0100. The solution was resolving. The captain made his decision at 0322. 2 Valfajer heavyweight torpedoes left the forward tubes in a 4-second interval. The Valfajer is Iran's domestically produced 533mm acoustic homing torpedo, developed after decades of dependence on foreign-supplied weapons, made clear that Iran needed indigenous production capability for its submarine force. It's a genuine anti-ship weapon, capable against a merchant vessel or a surface combatant operating without layered ASW protection. Its terminal seeker uses active and passive acoustic homing. Its 220-kilogram warhead is sufficient to cause catastrophic damage to most surface ship hulls. The Bush is not most surface ship hulls. More practically, the Valfajer was fired into a water column where 3 MH-60R helicopters were actively operating their dipping sonars on frequencies similar enough to the torpedo's own homing frequencies to contaminate the acoustic environment the weapon was trying to navigate. Romeo Flight Lead had the tube flooding transient at 0321, 45 seconds before the launch. The distinct hydraulic pressure signature of a submarine flooding its torpedo tubes propagates through water with an acoustic fingerprint that the AQS-22's classification library recognizes specifically. By the time the first Valfajer cleared the tube, Romeo 1's crew already had a targeting solution on the firing platform. Pre-delegated weapons-free authorization for carrier defense had been in effect for 72 hours. Romeo 1 did not need to wait for permission. The first Mark 54 lightweight hybrid torpedo entered the water at 0323, 13 seconds after the Valfajer launches were confirmed. The second Mark 54 followed from Romeo 2's position, offset 750 meters to the northeast to eliminate the lateral escape corridor. The Mark 54 is the result of a specific engineering program. Take the advanced guidance electronics from the Mark 50 heavyweight torpedo, a system designed for deep-water nuclear submarine prosecution, and engineer them into the smaller Mark 46 airborne torpedo body to create a weapon that could be carried and deployed by helicopters while retaining the acoustic discrimination capability needed for shallow water prosecution in complex environments. The guidance system classifies targets against its acoustic library in real time, rejects false contacts including marine mammals and thermal anomalies, and adjusts its homing geometry based on the target's maneuvering response. At 85 to 100 meters depth against a 74-meter steel hull with a strong residual acoustic signature, moving at 4 knots in water, where the thermal layering was well characterized by 4 days of sonobuoy data, the Mark 54's classification problem was not a difficult one. The Iranian captain had approximately 65 seconds between the moment his crew detected the incoming torpedoes on passive sonar and the first impact. He ordered emergency blow on the ballast tanks and emergency full power on the electric drive and turned toward the incoming weapons to present the minimum possible hull profile. These are the correct tactical responses. They reflect training and experience and the proper execution of doctrine. They were insufficient by a margin that the physics of the engagement had already determined. The first Mark 54 detonated beneath the keel at frame 31. Underwater explosions induce a shock wave that propagates through water with minimal energy loss, arrives at the target hull, and transfers its energy into the structure faster than the steel can flex to absorb it. The resulting whipping stress, the hull bending rapidly in response to the impulse load, fractures a pressure vessel at its structural weak points faster than damage control can respond. The Kilo's pressure hull failed at 2 frame junctions within the first second after detonation. The boat was lost. The second Mark 54 was recalled. The 2 Valfaja torpedoes ran their search patterns for 22 minutes after the submarine's destruction before their fuel exhausted and they sank. The acoustic environment they were hunting through had been thoroughly disrupted by the helicopter dipping sonars. Their homing systems could not resolve the carrier's signature from the background noise with enough confidence to commit to a terminal run. They found nothing and fell. The George H.W. Bush continued northeast at 18 knots. Her heading and speed were unchanged. Flight operations had been briefly suspended during the prosecution and resumed at 0348. The E-2D Hawkeye that had been scheduled for a 0340 launch went airborne 8 minutes late. The cost accounting has a specific structure that reveals the strategic asymmetry more clearly than the tactical summary does. Iran expended 1 Kilo-class submarine. At current Russian defense export pricing, a Project 877 EKM hull costs approximately $350 million in baseline configuration. The more significant constraint is not price, but availability. Russia is not selling Kilo-class submarines to Iran under the current sanctions regime, and Iran's domestic naval industrial base cannot produce a comparable large displacement diesel-electric hull. The Kilo fleet reduced from 3 boats to 2, and the 2 remaining face the same operational environment that destroyed this one. The boat's crew of 52 did not survive. Iranian submarine crews require years of specialized training that cannot be quickly replaced. Iran also expended 2 Valfaja torpedoes at an estimated production cost of $1.6 million each. Total Iranian expenditure: 1 irreplaceable strategic asset, 52 experienced submariners, and $3.2 million in weapons that accomplish nothing. The United States expended 2 Mark 54 Mod 1 torpedoes at approximately $870,000 each, 3 MH-60R sorties in terms of fuel and maintenance costs, and a fraction of the P-8 operational budget that had been running the approach surveillance for 4 days. Total direct munitions cost, approximately $2.1 million. The strategic return on $2.1 million was the permanent removal of 1/3 of Iran's heavy submarine capability from the order of battle. The accumulation of a complete acoustic and tactical dataset on Iranian Kilo operations under real patrol conditions that will inform American ASW planning for years. And the demonstration to Iranian Naval Command that the acoustic complexity of the Gulf of Oman does not provide the protection their doctrine assumed. The intelligence harvest is worth examining separately. The 4 days of P-8 sonobuoy coverage, the Chung-hoon's passive acoustic record, the AQS-22 dip data from 3 helicopter positions, and the fire control solution, generated during prosecution, collectively produced a detailed acoustic signature library entry for this specific kilo hull under operational conditions. Speeds, depths, battery state, machinery noise levels, crew response patterns under threat. That library entry exists in American targeting databases. The two surviving kilo boats produce their own entries every time they leave port. The Iranian Navy's understanding of this situation is evident in the pattern that emerged in satellite imagery over the weeks following the engagement. The two remaining kilo boats, which had been maintaining regular patrol rotation schedules, remained in their pens at Bandar Abbas for an extended period. Training exercise activity declined noticeably. The operational posture of a force reassessing its assumptions looks different from the operational posture of a force preparing for its next deployment. The assumption being reassessed is the foundational one, that the geometry and acoustics of the Persian Gulf's approaches provide sufficient acoustic cover to allow a quiet submarine to approach an American carrier undetected. The P-8 sonobuoy pattern had established a detection datum from a 14-second snorkel mast exposure at the edge of its coverage range 4 days before the engagement. The MH-60Rs had resolved the contact to targeting quality accuracy from acoustic data alone before any active pings were transmitted. The Mark 54s had prosecuted successfully in shallow water with complex thermal layering. Every element of the engagement validated what Iranian doctrine had assumed it could prevent. The broader observation that any Navy watching this engagement had to incorporate was a simple one. The acoustic complexity of warm, shallow, commercially trafficked water is a processing problem, and American ASW processing has been solving that specific problem systematically for 40 years. The thermal layers that scatter sonar energy don't disappear, but they're characterizable. The commercial shipping noise that masks submarine signatures doesn't go away, but it's filterable when the signal processing algorithms have been trained on enough real-world data to separate it reliably from submarine acoustic profiles. The Kilo's anechoic tiles are genuine engineering. They work. They reduce the boat's acoustic signature to the point where detection required specific attention to an acoustic absence rather than a positive contact. That's a meaningful capability. It's not a sufficient capability against a system that knows what an acoustic absence in this specific water column should look like, and treats its presence as a datum rather than a null result. The Romeo helicopters landed back aboard the Bush at 0406. Refueling and post-flight checks completed by 0441. They were available for the next cycle before the carrier's scheduled 0500 flight operations commenced. Somewhere below 90 meters of Gulf of Oman water, the seafloor holds what Iran spent 20 years acquiring and another decade maintaining at considerable cost to an economy that could not easily absorb it. Tehran's naval planners had built their doctrine around the proposition that this boat could threaten a carrier. What the Gulf of Oman confirmed is that a threat which has been tracked since it left port, prosecuted from assets it cannot detect, and engaged by weapons specifically designed for the acoustic environment it was counting on for concealment, is not a threat in any operational sense. It's a problem, and the Americans had been working on the solution before the submarine cleared the harbor. If this breakdown gave you a clearer sense of how modern anti-submarine warfare actually works beneath the surface, share it and subscribe. The engagements that define who controls the sea happen in darkness, without witnesses, and are over before most people know they started.